Good morning, friends. Today I'd like to consider some of the implications that come out of the fact that sin itself is determined by the nature of who God is. As we affirmed yesterday, sins are sinful, they're wrong, they can be classified as evil and wicked, primarily because they are actions, words, or even thoughts that go contrary to the nature of God. Therefore, sin, in whatever form it takes, is essentially a rejection of God himself, who is the very one who created us and sustains us, and therefore sin must be taken very, very seriously. And the fact that the way in which we identify and define sin, the fact that it's so connected with God's nature, means that there are some pretty significant implications for us to consider. Two that I want to talk about today. The first is that the standard of righteousness and wickedness, the standard of what is virtue and what is sin, it's an absolute standard that is not only connected with the nature of God, but it's a standard that is unavoidably reliant on the nature of God. What I mean by that is if God did not exist as he is, if he was not himself the standard, then there would be no true standard of right and wrong. Without a moral lawgiver, God, there can be no actual moral law. Now, atheists, agnostics, and other skeptics of God's existence reject this notion because they don't like it as a proof for God's existence or as significant evidence for God's existence. As Christians, we look at a world that has a fairly twisted sense of morality, but there are still some things that basically are universally agreed upon, things that everyone says is wrong, and Christians point to those things, or really, in truth, any standard of morality that people want to hold to, and we say, you can't hold to that system of morality or any system of morality without God, because you, again, can't have a moral law without a moral lawgiver. And of course, the skeptic rejects this idea outright, responding that they don't need some magic sky daddy to tell them right from wrong. But in truth, even if we ignore the straw man argument of calling the God of the universe a magic sky daddy or something similar, in truth, they absolutely do need such a perfect being to tell them right from wrong. Because if there is no absolute and ultimate standard, God, to serve as the standard of what is right and wrong, then you can come up with any system of morality that you want, but there will never be any actual lasting foundation for it or meaningful foundation for it. There will never actually be any authority behind it. The best you can come up with is that a culture, a society of people form themselves the foundation for whatever the morality is going to be. But again, if that's your foundation, you're building on quicksand. Because whatever system of morality you build on that shifting sand has absolutely no weight or authority to it whatsoever. Because at that point, it's simply might makes right. Whoever can get the most votes, whoever can scream the loudest, whoever can cajole or pressure, or just whoever literally has enough power to cram their system of morality down on everyone else, well, they win, and that is the system in place until someone else gets the power to cram down their system of morality on people. And one system of morality in this scheme cannot be said to be better than any other because there's no fixed standard. Now, of course, people will say, well, there is a standard. It's whatever causes the most amount of good for the most amount of people. So there is something to shoot for. But that doesn't make any sense either, because they can say that's the standard, but they don't actually have any reason for that to be the standard. If a small group of people can impose their will on others to gain what they want most, even if it causes untold suffering in the vast majority of people, why should that be considered wrong if there isn't an objective, absolute standard to base things off of? After all, if there is no God to set this, we're just a bunch of chemical reactions walking around. What does it matter what one chemical reaction does to another chemical reaction? There's no point or purpose. There's no meaning or value to anything or anyone anyway. And so people will try to, on one hand, exclude God from the equation, and therefore they are willing to say that there's no meaning or value. but then they try to hold on to the idea that human life is valuable and therefore it must be preserved. It's completely inconsistent. But the reason why people are willing to be inconsistent is because we are created. There is a God, and people can't actually fundamentally live any other way. At least very few people can. And so they'll claim that such thinking is ludicrous and that we really ought to care about the well-being of others. And of course, we would agree. But in order to use consistent logic and come to that conclusion, you must start with a creator who gave human beings inherent worth, as God most certainly did, because he is the standard. He is the God of life, and he created us with purpose and meaning, and therefore promoting life in the human race for a purpose and with meaning is a good thing. But if there is no God, that standard of promoting life no longer has any logical reason to exist. So, God's existence as moral lawgiver and the fact that right and wrong are determined by his nature as that lawgiver, well, whether people want to admit it or not, that fact is a massive win for the Christian worldview. The existence of morals, even twisted and rotten morals, is incredible evidence that a moral lawgiver does indeed exist. And in addition to that, the second implication for today is we know that proper morals, or perhaps more precisely, I should say, proper ethics, what ought to be done, what is true about right and wrong, these things are universal in nature, because being founded on God's nature, well, they're universal because God is universal, right? He is the God of heaven and earth. Therefore, murder is going to be sinful and wicked no matter what society you're in, no matter where on earth, no matter what age of the earth you might be considering. Now, granted, that doesn't mean that the various societies, the various peoples have always thought themselves about the same way about murder, but that's just people rebelling. It doesn't mean that the reality of murder isn't the same anywhere and everywhere. It is, because God is the standard. Because the truth is that ethics, right and wrong, what ought to be done, said or thought, do not depend on human beings. They do not depend on culture or societies, but on God. And God does not change. In Malachi 3:6, God states it plainly, saying, "For I, the Lord, do not change." So when that skeptic says, well, you have to take the culture into account, we can, with compassion and gentleness, but also with firmness, we can say, no, we do not need to take the culture into account. We need to take God into account, which just once again reveals the fundamental nature of sin itself. Because what are people really saying when they say you have to take the culture into account in order to identify right or wrong? They're saying, I refuse to use God as the standard of right and wrong. We're instead going to use mankind as that standard. And we're right back there to that cosmic treason. But we, dear brother and sister, can stand firm in the truth. We can uphold the truth, declare the truth, and live by the truth. God is himself the standard of righteousness, of virtue, of all that is actually and truly good. And all that is opposed to that standard is by definition sin and wickedness. So let us, as God's people, hunger and thirst for God's righteousness and be thankful that that is a standard that never changes. With this in mind, I pray you have a good and godly day today, and Lord willing, I will see you soon.